Hello, welcome to Security Insights. I'm Gunnar Peterson, CISO at Forder, a trust platform for digital commerce. Our guest today is Wendy Nather. Welcome to you, Wendy.
Oh, thanks for having me, Gunnar. It's great to be here.
Wendy, it's fair to say you've worn a lot of hats in your career. Is that fair to say?
It's true. It is true. Yeah.
So Wendy leads the Advisory CISO at Cisco for the people who don't know, and she was previously a CISO in the public and private sectors. She led the information security practice at the analyst firm 451, and she was also research director at the Retail ISAC, and is a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Cyber Statecraft Initiative, as well as the Strauss Center for International Security and Law at the University of Texas at Austin, among many, many other accomplishments. So Wendy, it's great to have you here. One of the things I've always appreciated about your career is the fact that I think, and I remember when I first met you and somebody said, "You don't know Wendy Nather, what the heck?" And I think the thing that gets you a lot of respect, certainly from the community, for myself, is being able to distill what matters and share what works, which I think are two really underappreciated themes in our community. And I'm curious, before we dive into today's topic of SBOMs, software bill of materials, what do you think about, what did you learn in things like the Retail ISAC and other groups that you've been in where you can share information across communities and across groups? Like what is uniquely helpful about that in our world of information security, in your opinion?
Um, well, one of the things that I learned that's very important is that trust happens between individuals, not organizations. And so everything that you want to nurture about any kind of information sharing, whether it's you're mentoring somebody or you're sharing some lessons learned from an incident or you're sharing threat intelligence or anything like that, is that you have to start with the people involved and you have to be ready to accommodate what both parties need. And so some of the sharing can come, in the form of memes. It can come in the form of of long stories. First this happened and then we did this and then that happened and everything. um, and a lot of it has to do with intermediaries sometimes. Like at the Retail ISAC, I would get a call from somebody saying, well, we saw this anonymized data from somebody, but we have questions, can we talk to them? So I'd go back to the original submitter and say, hey, Target wants to talk to you. Is it okay if I tell them who you are? And they say, oh yeah, we like Target. So there's a lot of um, messy intermediary things going on between any kind of information sharing. The second thing that I learned a lot of is just how many constraints there are in every environment. So anything that you would think would work just fine, that conventional wisdom says, oh yeah, you should be doing that. I've seen a place where it just couldn't work, for really good reasons. So that's the other thing is how messed up things are.
Well, and uniquely messed up, right? Like I think the context really matters, and what matters in a Retail ISAC is probably not the same thing that matters in the FS ISAC, across. If you've made the top five list of each, it's probably a different. Four of the five are probably very different. So I do like your point too about first this happened and then that happened, because today's topic, and I like to sort of deep dive into one area with interesting thinkers in the space on this podcast. And today's topic is a great example: software bill of materials, or SBOM. That's something that probably didn't really matter, and then it really mattered, or maybe it always mattered and people finally realized it mattered. But in any case, it's something that had been around for a long time as a concept, and I think a couple of events happened that really catalyzed the efforts of people like Alan Friedman and things, and people like that have been out there doing the hard work, digging in the garden for years, planting the seeds, so that when the focus came along, we were there and able to act on it. But for people who don't know, SBOMs are really about enumerating and making a formal definition of all the things that go into building a piece of software. And it makes sense intuitively that if you read the label on your breakfast cereal every morning, why would you not do the same thing for the software that you click on and the software you run your business on and your healthcare and your financial systems and everything else? So I guess my question for you out of the gate to open this up on SBOMs, Wendy, is like, to me, we've been doing security for a while, both of us, and we've seen things come and go in terms of things that were important seeming but didn't get the focus, and then all of a sudden, SIM matters everywhere because it gets encoded into PCI, let's say, as an example. So this isn't the first time something went from good idea to we have to do this now. And why do you think that SBOMs, there's an executive order out there, there's vendors competing in this space, what do you think the catalysts are? Why does SBOMs matter, and why do they matter now?
Boy, I don't actually know. I'm very aware of the spotlight of attention in the
Mhm.
infosec community, and the moving spotlight shines, and having shown moves on, and nor all that thy piety nor wit will never mind. The you know every so often the spotlight will turn to another thing, and we go, oh my god, we've got to do something about this. Have we solved the other things that the spotlight was originally on? No, but we are chasing that spotlight across the stage and around every so often. So why now? Probably because of the supply chain attacks that were the right combination of widespread scope, interest, sexiness, because there's a lot of cloak and dagger involved in supply chain attacks. And I just think you had all the right ingredients for the public to take an interest in it. And that's about all I can tell you.
Yeah, I think those seem like key ingredients to move something to the top of the list. I think one of the things that you hit on there, as it relates to the supply chain, in your day job, advising CISOs and security decision makers, if you can put yourself in their shoes for a moment and move beyond the theory, and how do organizations get value out of SBOMs? I know you recently published a paper on the Atlantic Council where you enumerated a few use cases, and I think it'd be fun to step through each of those use cases, because the concept of enumerating all of the components it's a nice piece of information, but is it useful? Is a second question. And I think one of the things your paper did a great job at is talking about four really discretely different types of value you can get out of an SBOM. Two of which, I think, incident response and vulnerability management, are core infosec use cases. Maybe we could start with those and start with incident response as a use case. Like, how, if you're a CISO at a retail company or someplace else, or a security architect, decision maker, how do you think about SBOMs as it relates to creating value in incident response?
Oh, well, going back to your original question, why are SBOMs even valuable to begin with? I think that the overall answer is visibility, and that's one of the most basic things about infosec that when I bring out a pyramid, if I need a pyramid for a talk or anything, generally the bottom layer that you need for a program is knowing what you have. And it just sounds very basic, and yet it is one of the hardest things to do, knowing what you have. And this is just another case of knowing what you have, except at the software level.
And it's the kind of thing where if it's already done because your engineering team or your infrastructure team has already done it, maybe the infosec team doesn't have to do it. But I think a lot of infosec teams are in the position where it hasn't been done. So technically, maybe it shouldn't be an infosec job, but if nobody else has done it, then the firefighters have to build the map of the building before they go running into the building to fight the fire, kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly. Whoever's on call for fighting the fires is the one who's going to be most motivated, most interested in knowing what's there and knowing the lay of the land. When you respond to anything, you got to know what's there. And so visibility is top of the list for any CISO that I talk to when I ask them, why do you want an SBOM? What are you going to do with it? They really need the visibility. And that's great. And yet at the same time, my next question is always, well, then what are you going to do with that information once you have it? You know, and in some cases for incident response, as you brought up, for anything like Log4j, at first, the first question is always, do we have that? Are we affected by it? And then what are we going to do about it? So just even asking, do we have that? And it's at a level where we, by default, generally don't have enough information. We don't have that visibility. It's like taking a group of people and saying, how many people are in the room? Okay, great. Now, what's their C-reactive protein levels in each of those people? There might be a good reason for knowing, but it's suddenly a level of granularity that nobody really knows how to handle yet. We're finding out how to generate that level of visibility, but translating it to something useful on the consumer side is something that we're still working on, as you know.
Yeah, I do think that those use cases like or the threats that we saw around Log4j, around struts a few years ago, around OpenSSL, which was I think a near miss for a lot of folks this fall. Those are all areas where SBOM has continued to gain credence of not just a useful tool, but a very practical and timely tool. So one of those ones where every pen tester has their top tools. They have to have their Nmap, they have to have their SQL map, whatever it is. Everybody has their preferred tools. I think SBOMs are really working their way up the list of like, this is one of the first, if not the first place I'm going to go when something like this happens, which is a pretty unique position in the industry. I don't think, there aren't that many tools that can gain that status of I'm going here first, and then I'll go check the other places. So that's kind of interesting.
Right. And I think that this also, the concept of SBOMs came along at a good time where the content of software is more variable than ever because so much of it is assembled now rather than being written and assembled from a wide variety of components and sources. So I think all of that came together to say, wait a minute, we've been making this patchwork of our software. Now you can't just go to your engineering department and say, okay, what's in here? Because nobody knows. So that's, I think, the other reason why SBOMs have become so critically important right now.
That's interesting. Yeah, and I think so. The supply of incidents, unfortunately, is evergreen. We have an evergreen supply of incidents. More of them are in the sweet spot that play to SBOM strengths. Another thing we have as an evergreen supply is vulnerabilities in the industry. And you talked a little bit in the paper about vulnerability management and how SBOMs help there. One of the things I find interesting too is everybody who is in the security industry is used to having a signal to noise problem with vulnerabilities. That's nothing new. But prioritizing inside of those and making sense of what is in there is quite a challenge. How do you see SBOMs helping in vulnerability management in general, helping in prioritizing what to go after first?
Well, I think a lot of lessons that we've already learned from vulnerability management in general in our own software is going to help us now figure out what to do with these presumably external components that have been incorporated and dependencies that go outside of the organization. I remember going through lots of vulnerability reports together with Matt Tesoro when we worked together, and trying to prioritize and slice them in many different ways, like what can we fix most efficiently that's going to give us the biggest bang for the buck, what impacts the most critical sensitive data, what's part of a system that we actually control, what isn't. There are so many things that you can ways that you can prioritize vulnerability management. The other issue is, what are you going to be able to remediate in what time frame, and can you keep track of it? So a lot of times you're going to look at something and say, well, we can't update this until we update this other thing, and that's not going to happen for 6 months. Or if we update this, this is going to break the stack that's been certified by our vendor, and we have to wait for them to certify the updated components, and that's going to take a certain amount of time. So there's a lot of project management that goes into that sort of vulnerability management. And SBOMs are not going to be any easier. In fact, I think they'll be more complicated, because you'll find vulnerabilities and go, okay, who's supposed to fix this? And it turns into negotiation and within the open source community or wherever you're getting it from, and then saying, well, we can't wait, we're going to fix it ourselves, but we can't fix these 2 other instances of this in our environment because of dependencies. We'll have to do that later. So again, I think it just complicates the problem space for good reasons, but it's something that we're going to have to work hard on getting a handle on.
I think those are all great points, to which I'd add one other. In a lot of the cloud container worlds, the SBOMs are changing almost every time a developer hits the keyboard, hits enter. And I think that's they can be point in time specific to a very real degree, where days and weeks will matter. And if you're going back to remediating vulnerabilities or dealing with incidents, knowing when the software was built, just that one simple piece, that the temporal element is quite useful too. So,
and knowing even when it was in use, that's the other issue for incident response and forensics. Do you have enough logging data to be able to tell when that particular version was in use in your environment, assuming that you discover a breach, months later? Because it's not always immediate. So having to find out whether that it was in use, whether that function was even being called. In other words, did it have a material impact on the probability of you having had a breach? Those are also questions that we still need to deal with.
Yes, and I really like how you framed it, and again, back to my opening comments, how you kind of distill into the what matters pieces, because for better and for worse,
I like small words.
I come out of the sort of Ross Anderson school, and I have my brain is sort of trained to think threat and then countermeasure and then test case, and I just sort of have that hardwired into my cognition. And SBOMs are a great example of where, starting from like the pyramid view that you talked about earlier, starting from visibility out actually gets you into a different space, because it's not like there's a specific threat that drives you to an SBOM, but an SBOM is a fantastic enabling technology to help you reap benefits across a whole bunch of different use cases, which makes it super interesting, in a different way of thinking and solving problems, which we definitely need in this industry. So 2 other use cases. I wanted to go off of the InfoSec track for a moment and back to your paper. 2 of the things you talked about, I think it's fair to say that information security programs don't always get classed as, oh, you're the most business-focused department in our whole company. Sometimes some information security departments might be saying, are you aligned with the business as much as you could be? And one of the things I appreciated in your paper was the talk of how SBOMs can help procurement. And so that is an area where we're rolling up our sleeves and supporting a more efficient business and a more focused business. Could you talk a little bit about the role that SBOMs play in procurement?
Yeah, and I should mention that inside of Cisco, we've been working with SBOMs for internal purposes for many years. And this is one of the use cases that just popped right out is, did you know a company the size of Cisco can end up buying duplicate instances of software? And, are we spending too much? Can we consolidate all these licenses? Or Did somebody incorporate something with the wrong license that legally speaking we cannot use? All those sorts of issues that are of more interest to the COO and the legal team. And that's a great hook to bring in the usability of SBOMs and say, would you just like to know, what our software licensing situation is? And can we put in, let's say, easy to make decisions before procurement that we are never, ever going to adopt something that has the wrong kind of software license on it? Or are we never, ever going to procure anything that has its sources in a country that we don't like, or things like that? That's a pretty understandable use case that the business can get behind. And it's a good place to start because those are yes and no questions that you can agree on with your legal team. And you can stop a procurement or stop the integration of some open source software right from the beginning with that sort of list.
So I guess what I'm hearing for the other CISOs on the call who are doing their budgets for 2023 right now is they can get their procurement partners to pay for the SBOM software, and they can use it for all these other ancillary benefits.
That would be nice, wouldn't it?
Is that how it works?
Great. It reminds me of a time when we got some database monitoring software and we were running it, and we found that there was, and this was in the security team, and we found that there was a query that was taking 23 minutes to return. And so I went down the hall to the DB admins and said, did you know this is going on? And one of the project managers happened to be there, and she said, oh, that explains why we're having performance problems with that application. So you never know what sort of visibility information is going to be useful to other parts of the organization. You should always be on the lookout for that.
Yeah, and that really ties to the fourth use case. The last use case you mentioned in the paper was ecosystem mapping and understanding your dependencies and things like that. Is there anything you want to add to the value of ecosystem mapping that we haven't talked about so far from the SBOM perspective?
Well, one of the things that we could talk a little bit more about is the use of SBOMs for threat intelligence specifically. I know of one startup called Ion Channel that scans open source repositories and tracks the contributors across the ecosystem, and can dig things up like, did you know that this person who contributed this module to this open source project also is known to have contributed to some malware groups projects? Are you sure you want to use their software? And that's the sort of thing that we used to joke about, where, if we found a vulnerability in some software and we know who wrote it, we'd go look at their LinkedIn to see where else they worked. And then we could go look at the software from those other companies because they might have the same vulnerability written into them. So looking at a contributor developer-centric view and using SBOMs to inform that who is contributing to your software can be every bit as important as, where did you get this or what's in it?
Yeah, that is a great point, and definitely one that warrants a lot of investigation. So I think the thing that the paper does really, really well is it talks about the value proposition, the value that organizations get out of using SBOMs. I'll put some links in the show notes about tools and other things for people who want to get started and looking at some of the Cyclone DX and SIFT and some of the other tools that people are potentially interested in, as well as a link to the paper. What are some of the other things that you think of that you would recommend as next places to go for people who are looking to get started with SBOM?
Oh, really good question. Well, there is that paper that I and my colleagues at the Atlantic Council wrote together for use cases, but I have to go back to Alan Friedman and just give him a salute again for all the work that he has
one for me too.
Yeah.
I mean, how long has that guy been on this?
I don't know. He was working on multi-party vulnerability disclosure and moved on to SBOMs, and he always tackles the hard projects and does a lot of the dirty work so that we don't have to.
Yeah.
By the
Yeah.
time we get it, it's in a pretty good shape to go and start doing something with it. So I really like that. There are lots of good projects out there. There's the Git Bomb project,
Mm.
and let me think of some other ones that people want to look at. But
There's a fair amount at OWASP and Dependency Check and a lot
yeah,
of others too. So
there is, and again, but I have to keep driving back to the question of, this is great stuff, but what are you going to do with it? What
right.
decisions are you going to make once you have it? And I think that's, just knowing may not be enough. And in fact, if
Mm.
you know or you suspect that something is being used, but you can't prove it, this is where your management's going to get really upset, because do you have to disclose or do you not have to disclose if you get enough information, but not enough to really pin it down? So always
Right.
be careful in asking for more data, because it may make your life worse.
Well, yeah, and I think well, so I'm glad that Alan Friedman is on our side,
Yes.
and we have people like that, and I'm glad for all of the reasons that you just said, that you're on our side too, Wendy. Um, I know you also have a little bit of light versifying that you've done along these lines. Is there anything else you'd like to share on the topic of SBOMs? Perhaps something set to a, I don't know, Gilbert and Sullivan or sea shanty, perhaps.
Sea shanty, perhaps. Well, the first thing when I started looking at SBOMs was, of course, what do you do with a vendor? SBOM, what do you do with a vendor? SBOM. And I could not get it out of my head. So the first talk I gave, which was in an OWASP event, it had exactly that title. And yeah, if you can sing about it, then maybe you can solve it. I don't know. That's a maxim I just made up.
But I think you can make it stick, and that's in people's brains, and that's an art in and of itself in this space where we're submerged with ideas and marketing concepts and architectures. It's hard to tell the architecture from the architecture sometimes.
Mhm.
So making sure that the important stuff really sticks is a real gift. You certainly have that, and Wendy Nather, can't thank you enough for joining the podcast today.
Thank you so much, Gunnar.